You're listening to Japanese Baptist Church in Seattle, Washington. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of JBC Connect. And for those of you who are following, this is our space to have conversations, reflections, and different things. And today, I am very happy to say that Reverend Dr. Tim Phillips is our guest today. And as many of you probably already know, he is the senior pastor of Seattle First Baptist Church, which has a beautiful and long history, and Tim has definitely been an important part of that. There's so many other things I could say, Reverend Phillips, the pastor, I could say Dr. Phillips, the scholar, and, Reverend Phillips with his passion for activism, peacekeeping. There's a whole piece there. And then to add to it, we just heard the big news about a forthcoming retirement. So many things. So I just want to get into it. So thank you, Tim, so much for making the time here.
Thanks for asking me.
Yeah. And so how are you doing? This is a kind of funny time to be a pastor, isn't it?
It is. It is. Yeah. Excuse me.
No problem.
I was ordained in 1981, and there were a lot of ins and outs of the early experience of my being ordained. But one thing that never changed was that ordination represented a commitment to the local church. If I were to be the doctor part of Dr. Tim Phillips, I would say that I love the academy and I love learning and education, but all in the service of the local church. If I were to be the activist part of Tim Phillips, which I don't always see myself as being, I would say that's in the service of the local church and the outreach, the mission of the local church.
That's great. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
I was going to say that the pastor part was more in question because I grew up in a minister's home, and honestly, the last thing I wanted to do was to be a pastor. I saw what my dad went through, and the last church he served for 40 years, and that can do a lot to someone to spend that much time in the same place. And so when I went off to college, I decided that I would be an English major, and then ended up taking all Bible and history classes, and then went off to the University of Chicago to ideally become a liberal arts professor at some college somewhere someday. And so what happened, what brought me into ministry was a church start in Chicago. About 8 of us got together and decided that there was a need for some kind of socially progressive, evangelically oriented congregation. And so we came together and we thought, okay, so somebody should be pastor. And I had the educational credentials to do that. And so I became pastor, and I said, okay, I'll do this until we're at a place where we can call somebody else. And that didn't happen. Then I went into seminary education, and that felt like a ministry to me until I got drawn to University Baptist here in Seattle. And at that point felt like, okay, I cannot be Jonah anymore, running away from whatever it is that God is calling me to. I guess I should just say, this is my calling. And so the pastor part went through, as I say, all kinds of fluxes and intersections, and it took me a while to settle into a role where I felt like I was doing what it was particularly that God had called me to do. And so I say that in answer to the long answer to your question, um, to say that I've had to do ministry in a lot of different settings. Um, the church start, working with an academic institution, working with a small church when I first came here to Seattle. That was uh, in the decision-making process about how it could go forward, and then to this historic church. And so in each one of those, I've had to adapt to a different context. Never would I have thought, however, that I would be having to adapt to this pandemic life in ministry. And it's hard. My joke is that I spent my whole life being trained that ministry was being a non-anxious presence, and I feel now like I'm an anxious non-presence. I can't be with people, and that brings all this anxiety about what's going on, and where are people, and are they hanging in there, and there isn't enough time in a day or a week or a month to have those kinds of conversations, and you don't have the eye, people passing you out the door on a Sunday morning or in coffee hour where you can kind of assess, so, Jane doesn't look like she's doing so well. I had better check in with her this week, or we don't have that.
Yeah, that's a really, thank you for sharing that. Actually, that's really great just to hear this broad overview of your life history. And I don't know if we've actually had the conversation, but we're both pastors' kids.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that you had the same baggage I did. Is that I had a very similar struggle with my calling, is that I just saw what my dad went through. And I was like, I don't know if I can do that. Because a lot of folks who aren't in a family with clergy, they don't realize, like, you get to see a front row seat of like all the stuff in the background, and like you see what they're holding together. You see like the toll it takes on your parent, but also like on the entire family system. And it's just a miracle anyone goes into ministry, right? If you see that stuff. So the fact that we're in ministry right now is really just like, it's just a miracle of God, isn't it?
It's all grace. It's all grace.
But, and what also I was thinking as you're just speaking right now, it kind of connects also with that idea of the local church, as you're talking about, is so ingrained in our blood, in our DNA. And the local church, kind of like the whole paradigm behind it, is that we connect people, and we connect people to each other, and we connect people to God. And I get that sense from you, like even in the academy, like, you're just an extremely personable individual, like just really thinking about relationships and individuals. And so both of us have been born into this. We've been, I don't know, raised by this. We've been like trained by this kind of mindset of just relationality. And then you hit it really beautifully about at the end, now that we're in the pandemic, like an unprecedented pandemic, which actually is almost like the exact opposite of that. It's all about separation, right? For the sake of care, we actually can't get too close.
That's right.
It literally. And it's almost like, I feel like maybe for folks like you and I, this is why this is so stressful, because it's going against everything that we are, right? Up to this point. And I love that phrase, anxious non-presence, because that's certainly what I also feel as well. Because we're not, you could argue, like in some ways, like just like kind of on paper, like physically, are we doing more, doing less? It's not even that about that for us, because it's more a mental, emotional, existential thing, is that we're not standing in we're not standing in who we are.
That's right.
And I think that's what's really difficult about this time.
That's right.
So,
and that anxiety, that anxiety creates a emotional toll on us, because there's this thing that we understand ourselves to be in ministry, and
Mm-hmm.
we can't do it, and
Yeah.
so we do the best we can to
Mm-hmm.
approximate that, and the emotional toll, it can just be, some days it can just be overwhelming, just to be honest.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
um,
Because we always know in our head, like this, no matter how much we're trying, we know like this is not enough or it's not what it's supposed to be.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's always kind of hanging over our heads.
Yeah.
Um, so I think, Tim, I should have talked to you at the beginning of the pandemic. Because like if we just had this conversation, it would have really helped me out. It would have been a lot more insightful. So this is my fault. You should have been the first guest. That's what I realized now that I'm listening to this.
No, 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 no.
But I really appreciate we're talking about this. So like in these times, these very unique times of pastoring, it sounds like the only way we can really get through this is like leaning even more than ever in self-care, not just for ourselves, but for others. What do you think self-care looks like? Or like, what do you think the message of self-care is for a pastor, for ourselves, and for our congregations right now?
Yeah, honestly, I struggle with that. Um,
Mm,
in some ways I have more time. I'm an introvert who's trained to be an extrovert. That's all part of the preacher's kid thing too, I think.
mm-hmm,
Um, and so I've had more time basically alone,
mm-hmm,
than I have ever had in my professional life. And yet that, instead of being a happy thing, it doesn't feed me. Um,
mm-hmm.
I realize that, in the Myers-Briggs way of things, it's, introvert or extrovert is how you process information and how you get energy. And it doesn't matter how introverted I may be on a personal level. The reality is that how I function as a pastor has depended on being able to exchange that extroverted energy that comes with actually being with people. And so
Mm-hmm.
um, I can't go to the normal thing that I do to take care of myself, which is to just have time away, to
Right,
be alone. I
right.
already have that, but that's not,
Mm-hmm,
that's not creating the uh, the energy that I need. So
mm-hmm.
I think in some ways it's personal. What are the things that you do when you're out of gas and you need to fill up again, as an individual person, only under the the context of where we are now.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I've started to do is to have conversations like this,
Mm,
um, to actually reach out to other pastors, and we have this conversation that we do about every other week with evergreen pastors, and I have made a point of being at that,
mm,
even though there might be other things I should be doing. I make a point of that, in part because I need to have that conversation with other pastors about what they're experiencing, and
mm.
so that's one of the things that I'm doing during this time. Um,
Yeah.
and I'm also trying to. This has been an issue all my life, and it goes back to the sort of measurements we have in our head about what it is to be a good pastor, having grown up in a minister's home.
Right.
Um, to say, um, to live into the word enough.
Mm,
This has always been I've never been enough, right? I've never been enough to be a good pastor. I've never been enough to be a good
mm,
partner. I've never been enough to meet all the demands of
mm,
especially the world in which we live right now.
mm-hmm.
Uh, and that's a hard habit to break.
Yeah.
um, and to settle into, okay, it is enough that I made these 3 phone calls today, and had good, interactions with someone. It is enough that I got that sermon written to be recorded at, ahead of time. It is enough that I had some study time in advance of a sermon or our Bible study, um, to to just try to settle into enough. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that for me is if a feeling of enough is what comes out of this pandemic time, then it will have accomplished something that I haven't been able to do my entire life. So
Wow.
um,
That's a profound statement.
I'm
Yeah.
hopeful that you know that grace is
Yeah.
working in me right now.
Mm. That's a really profound way to look at the pandemic, is like kind of a way to really reacquaint ourselves with great grace, right?
Right.
Because everyone all across the board, we can't accomplish what we want to. We can't do enough. And so maybe this is like this profound refining fire of our souls right now, to
Yeah.
just like, can you just lean into God's grace to realize that God's grace is sufficient for us?
Right.
Um, Wow, that is really profound. Thank you for sharing that. And I have to tell you, Tim, this is very unusual for me to be zooming my mirror image. I feel like I'm talking to myself with everything you're saying. I'm having a hard time being like an objective listener or something. I'm like, did he just read my mind? Did he just explain? That is amazing. And I was just thinking, Tim, like, I think we both admit like Myers-Briggs is not perfect. It's just a system framework for help us understand. But
Right.
I actually use it a lot as well in like a lot of pastoral work, just as a starting point to understand people.
Right.
And I wonder if it's not the IE thing that we struggle with so much, but it's the the intuitive part.
Yeah.
Because the intuitive part, from my understanding, is like, what makes us really interested in doing things that are meaningful,
Mm-hmm.
that are wide ranging, like interdisciplinary. Like
Right.
we like having these like huge like universal stage kind of
Right.
viewpoints. And I think maybe that's the thing that is just why, like, even though we're spending all this like recharge time on our own, we have tons of internal processing time. We don't feel like we're plugged into something bigger.
Right.
Like all the things that are like refreshing us, feeling like we're part of a something that's moving forward, something that
Mm.
is really helping people at a very high level, like really fulfilling morals and values, like that intuitive side of us, like, is not being accessed at all.
That's right.
And so that's why I think we're all like, ugh, you know? And then if anything, it feels like the pandemic is exposing all the systemic stuff that is so painful. And even though it's not true, we sort of feel like we're just sitting on the sidelines, and we're
That's
like,
right.
we
That's
can't
right.
do anything. Like, what can we do? And I think it maybe fills us with this like this heaviness and this dread, I guess, of and that's why no matter how much no matter how much time you have internally processing, like, it's just not renewing us.
That's right.
Uh, so, and I just came across it just because you kind of started talking. I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Um, oh, wow, there is so much here I want to unpack, but maybe bringing it forward, I feel like what you just said very candidly, very honestly by yourself is definitely very powerful words of pastoring,
Mm.
that for all of us, for our congregation members, about leaning into enough, and maybe even getting that beautiful exhortation is like, look, if all you, because we're told all kinds of things right now, the pandemic, like, this and that. I feel like I struggle with the whole word self-care, right? Like, I'm thinking, I'm sort of at a point now, like, I almost want to tell folks, like, look, just survive. I don't know. Just like, I just tell people all the time, be kind to yourself and just
Mhm.
survive, and it just sounds so less than, but I don't know what else to say, but I wonder if like you're saying is a lot more elegant and probably more scripturally grounded in that, um, which is always a good thing, isn't it? Is that God's grace is sufficient, right? Like, this is
Yeah.
really, um, I just think of like Paul's letter where he's just pleading with God, like, take out this thorn from my side. We're
Right.
just we're just praying for this pandemic to be over yesterday. We're just praying for it to be over, and it just doesn't happen. And then God just comes out to us and speaks to us, is that um, you need to learn that my grace is sufficient.
Right.
And when you are weak, that's when I'm strong.
Right.
And I I'm actually just processing this as we're talking right now, but like, it's just amazing that I feel like that just really helps me focus like what we need to be doing. So I really appreciate those words. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank you for the image of refining,
Mm,
because I think in the process of refining what is enough, there could be, I hope there will be, new priorities that come out of this time,
hmm.
together, you know, vocationally, financially, economically, uh,
Right.
in terms of relationally.
Hmm.
We were set on a pattern. I think the culture had set us on a pattern of so much um, uh, uh, aggrandizement, um,
Mm,
that couldn't be, that meant you could never be enough or have enough. Um,
mm,
and um, Now we're in this position where there's deep questions about, at least for me, about enough. What is enough? Am I enough?
yeah. Yeah.
You're a parent, and I think about the parents in our congregation who face that
Right.
tension every day when they're trying
Yeah.
to educate and care for their children and keep their jobs and take care of their home, and they can't go out.
Right.
You know, it's it will refine our. I think it has the potential for refining our values and our
Hmm.
priorities when this time is over. So,
Hmm. That's really profound. That there is like a direct connection between refining and transition, right?
right,
Like the whole point of refining is that it is preparing you to transition to like a new perspective, a new
that's right.
paradigm, or whatever. And I think a lot of pastors would argue that perhaps one of the greatest things we do as pastors is that we help people navigate transitions.
Yeah,
Um, Transitions into a deeper awareness of calling, transition of life stages, literally like transition into death, into life. Like we are present in every transition, which leads me to something I really wanted to touch on. Your church has been engaged in this long range planning.
yeah,
Um, and then during the discussions, from what I understand, I don't know much because I'm an outsider. You had announced that you'd be retiring in 2022,
right.
right? And those are like all of that, the long range planning, your retirement. This is all about transitions, isn't it? Um, and I find it really interesting that I found like in the conversations of a lot of pastors I'm talking to, um, there's been kind of discoveries and discussions that the church is not very good at transitions. As much as like this should be so much a part of who we are as pastors, like there seems to be something that's difficult about transitions. What do you think? What do you think is makes it so hard for pastoring transitions, and what makes it so hard for churches to transition?
So I think there's two kinds of transition, and one I think the church is really good at, and the
Mm.
other not so much. So
Okay. Yeah.
there's the natural transitions
Mm.
that we all experience. So transitioning from one stage of life, transitioning uh, through from life to death, transitioning into
Mm.
being a family.
Mm-hmm.
I think I mean one of the most powerful things about a congregation and ministry is to walk with people through those normal transitions of life. Um, then there's intentional transitions. Not that all natural ones don't have some intentionality about them, but
Mm.
to get together the energy and the power to choose a transition, that's a different thing. Um,
Mm.
and I think I think that intentional transition is hard for churches for a lot of reasons, mostly um, because the church has been with individuals through their individual transitions. They don't want that. They don't want that place that has provided that stability and constancy to change. And I that's the pastoral understanding, I think, of the resistance to change. So of course these people don't want to, they don't want to have anything happen to the building because this is where our children were dedicated, where we were married, where we
Right.
came into contact with God for the first time, they don't want it to change because it's had this
Mm,
important part in their life as they have transitioned through their own life experience.
mm,
But the truth is, we are, as a community, in a new context that is, I think, calling us to transition to a new way of being together. And that's hard. That's an intentional
yeah,
choice we make.
yeah.
And,
That's
and
really interesting. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think sometimes our theology gets in the way.
Mm,
The somewhat orthodox view that God doesn't change.
right,
That God is always the same. Jesus Christ the same
right.
today, yesterday, and forever.
Yeah,
Keeps
yeah,
the church from thinking that it has any forward movement it has to make, and if it does
yeah.
make movement, then it's betraying something. And,
Yes.
the process theologians, the people who I think, Octavia Butler, Pastor Anita got me turned on to Octavia Butler, the African American writer, who says
Mm,
God is change. Um, if we had a more favorable theology around change,
mm,
I think the church could make that shift more easily. And I think that's what leadership in ministry is calling us to do now. How can we be helpful in this intentional transition that the Spirit seems to be calling us to? And what is what's the understanding of God that helps us get there? So,
mm,
so for instance, one of the things I really hold on to is that great old hymn, "Great is Thy Faithfulness."
mm,
Thou changest not. Well,
mm.
you know, okay. The most important part is the next line, right? Your compassions, they fail not.
Mm-hmm.
That's the part to me that we hold on to as God is in this change that is pulling us
Right.
into a new future.
Yeah.
Um, so I think we have a lot of work ahead of us.
Yeah, that's really profound. I mean, thinking theologically and philosophically, right? Like a lot of Greco-Roman philosophy, right, really talked about the uh, unmoved mover of
Yeah.
the deity, and we actually import that into the Christian faith. Whereas actually, if we really look at like the Judeo-Christian God, like through the biblical lens, we see that God is a creator, which is all about, right, changing matter, like nothing into something. Um, it's a dynamic, like creative process. There's nothing static about God, right? If we're
Right.
looking at this, and then I think you really illustrate beautifully that there is a way to talk about God as reliable,
Mm-hmm.
like not failing us, as faithful, right? That's the biblical word, right? So you can say God is faithful, dependable,
Right.
but God is still changing the world around us,
Right.
creating.
Yeah. And God is in it. You know,
Yeah,
God is not just directing it from the outside. God is in it with
right,
us.
right. Mm-hmm.
When I talk about God, I always rely on Ephesians 3. There's a power already at work within us that's able to accomplish far more than any of us can ask or imagine. That's
Right,
God, and that power is already within us. It's not
right,
out there somewhere.
right. And then that makes an interesting statement where you're talking about how church loves just like natural changes. And what we kind of mean by that is like a lot of the ways we want to design churches to be this like kind of safe bubble that
Hmm.
we just kind of turn it on and just let it keep going, right?
Right,
Like you
right,
come in here, you're going to find a spouse here, you're going to get married, you're going to get a white picket fence. Like, I mean, it's like they've almost like prescribed your entire life. Like we want this little bubble, we want this building to look the same. And it's almost like antithetical to what we see in the scriptures is that God is this creative force, like disrupting powers,
right,
um, overturning things, so
right.
that new life can begin. Even dying, so that new life may start. Right.
That's right,
Um,
exactly.
and so, if we are kind of like holding on to paradigms, where like, we want this pastor to be with us forever. We want to embalm them. We want to have all this legacy, just for the sake of like preserving embalming things.
Yeah, right, right,
That's where the church goes really bad, right?
right,
Um, not to say like, but I think there's a way of like telling your story. Like we're trying to do an initiative where we're gonna create like a legacy library room. But it's very important for the committee that we're talking with. Is like we don't want to just tell the story and leave it in the past. We want to bring it to the present
right.
and see how it informs our future,
That's
right? And I feel like maybe that's the scary part, right? Like maybe people are just afraid that like if you let the future in, like you're gonna have to let go of the past, but you don't have to, right?
right.
And
There would be no future without the past. So,
right,
you might
right.
as well find a way to move things along that
Mm-hmm.
same trajectory, because
Mm-hmm.
the future, the future of 19. Let's say you all were formed in 1899, I think, right? Uh,
I believe so. Oh my gosh, I'm a bad pastor.
yeah,
Yes. 120 years ago
yeah,
yesterday.
yeah.
Last year.
I have my
Yeah.
cup here somewhere from the
Yeah.
125th.
I didn't prepare for the interview. I'm
No,
sorry,
no,
Tim.
that's all right. That's all right. That that there wouldn't be any future without those 125 years, right?
Yeah.
So it's the issue is not to say, okay, we've got this far, this is as far as we're going to go. It's to say we're taking this past into the future with us and
Uh-huh.
doing our best, again, that refining word, doing our
Yeah.
best to refine what
Mhm.
we have, um, how we've not engaged the world in good and compassionate ways in the
Mhm.
past, helping that lead us into what our response should be to the world now and into the future.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's really profound. I, gosh, there's so much more I'd want to lean into this, but I think it's interesting. Like when we're also doing, because like whenever you're in a transition, right? Like a transition like yourself, right?
Mhm.
And you still have like a year, some left, so it's not immediate, but it is coming up. It's always at those transitions where we're looking forward, but we're also looking backwards, right? At the
Right.
same time. And I wonder, what would you feel like you'd be saying to like your younger self, like for instance, like Tim the seminarian, or like Tim in Chicago, um, because I really want to ask this because it's interesting about the clergy. A lot of people don't realize like the profession of clergy. I had read somewhere that, well, I had heard somewhere that the median age for pastors is actually 55. And to think about any other quote industry, right? Any other vocation where actually the prime of your career is in your mid to late 50s,
Right.
right? Um, is very unusual, right?
Right.
Uh, so it feels like, well, are you saying that we only have like about 10 years of optimal like ministry or something? So that's why I think it's really interesting to talk to folks who are maybe transitioning to another stage. Like, what would you say to younger seminarians, right? Who, because ministry is a very different sense of time than I think any other vocation in the world, right?
Mhm.
Um, what would you want to say to yourself or to other like clergy, like as you're about to embark on this transition of change yourself?
Well, I think, and I can only say this from this perspective,
Sure.
40 some years down the road,
Right.
is to say, as you phrased it, lean into enough. Um,
Mm,
there will always be more than you can do. There will always be um, more expectations than are humanly possible. So find a way to settle into enough. And by that, I don't mean settling as in um, not uh, not growing, not reaching, not taking initiative.
mm,
But I would say, you know, in the company of other clergy, which I think is also important, um, discover what is enough for you. Um, Trusting in the God who is, as you say, is whose grace is sufficient,
mm,
regardless of what we think our thorns are. Because I think, I think the transition that I'm in right now is that as I get forced into more and to do more and more ministry online and using technology, I absolutely do not feel like I'm adequate for that. that I have the skill or the sort of intuitive sense of how these things work, and that makes me feel like I'm not enough. Um, those who come, those who are in a different generation, you and those that are younger, have a better sense of that, and it's just part of what your life has been. And so the good part about that is that you will have more intuitive skills around this way of doing ministry, and that's great. But it also generates even more expectations. I say about the internet that I have finally mastered the magical ability to be two places at the same time.
Right.
And that's not good.
Right.
um,
Right.
to be truly present is going to be even more and more. If that is, in fact, the mode of ministry, that's going to be more and more difficult
Mm-hmm.
as the next generation comes up into its experience of ministry.
Mm. That's really interesting too, because like I'm finding, because like I guess I'm on the end of Gen X technically. Just like I'll be 45 next week,
Oh,
and when I'm
happy.
talking, oh, thank you. But I'm talking to pastors who are millennials, and it's interesting. There's just a slight shift. Like for me, this time, it's interesting you say that, Tim, because for me too, like I've actually like we're kind of everything we're doing in church right now is kind of what I had said in my heart. Like I'm never going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I just didn't want to do internet. Like I saw people doing that, years ago, and I just
Right.
thought I don't want to touch this stuff. Um, but now I literally had to get like forced and pushed into it. And I've literally been like deconstructing all these habits and practices of ministry
Right.
that I thought were like, sacred, sacrosanct, kind of like this is what it is. And just deconstructing and then reconstructing on the fly this messy,
Right. Exactly.
scotch tape thing. And I'm just like, what
That
is this?
that's beautiful. That's exactly right.
And then I'm thinking like, oh man, I'm just looking to the younger folks. Like I bet it's easier for them because like, I feel so exposed. And then they're doing the same thing, but maybe their scotch tape is just a little different, maybe a little more put together.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's an interesting conversation, right? Like I feel like there's no one generation that's saying like, oh yeah, this is no problem. Like all of us are kind of like ripping
Right.
things apart, putting that together. Some of us might have more tools, but like I feel all of us, that whole um that was it, that pervading like anxiety about like just
Right.
ripping things, like we're all going through this in a weird way. Um Obviously it's harder for some folks more than others, but I think that's really helpful to hear about just like different people in different contexts, like how they're doing the deconstructing and reconstructing,
Right.
because like in a way it makes us feel like, look, even no matter what generation you're in, we're all doing it in our own way.
Right.
So I think that's really helpful. And like the things you're talking about, it's like those aren't things you graduate from, right?
No.
They're just it's like a lifestyle, right? Of just constantly coming back to grace, like just bringing yourself back. Like it takes the pressure off of feeling like, okay, you've got to have X amount of skills by this age, or
Right.
by 55, right? Like the median
Right.
age. You need to arrive, right? You'll never arrive, right? Is what we're kind of hearing.
Right.
So,
Right.
so for all future pastors out there, we just want to let you know is like, yeah, you'll never arrive. Wow, what an inspiring podcast. This is great. Anyways, oh man, Tim, I had like a couple other questions I really want to get into, but maybe this is a good spot to pause. And I've been saying this to almost all my guests, but like I think it'd be really interesting to check in with you every once in a while, just to see as you're going through this like year and a half, 2 years
Right.
that's coming up. Like it'd be interesting to see how your reflections and perspectives change
Yeah.
as your transitions like approach closer. So if that's okay, if you don't mind
Yeah.
me
Oh, sure. Yeah.
checking with you,
I'm
I
honored that
always
you would ask me. So,
I love talking with you, Tim. Like we've had a couple of good like sit downs for lunch, and I always walk away thinking like, oh, that's great. I feel very heard and understood when I hear about how you're processing things,
hmm.
because I think you know our church contexts are very different in some ways, but I think there's so many interesting parallels between the two.
There are.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so I really value just you being in our community, just being down the street. I
And I the same for you, Sam.
Yeah, and I'm such a well wisher of your ministry, and just really praying that as you're going through this time of really long lasting change, that God would really be with you in that. So
Thank you. And you. And you.
yeah, so I'm gonna just wrap up this episode. My heart is very thankful. I think there's a lot of great material here. I want to put into a sermon, so we're gonna so just it's gonna come, folks, for anyone who like listens to the messages. And thank you again, and we will see you soon in the next episode of JBC Connect. Everyone, take care. Thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you.